I'd buried a wife and 15 dry years in the Diller Valley before I ever rode up the Sabino Fork to beg water off a people the whole territory had taught me to hate. And I will tell you plain, right here at the start, so there's no mistaking it. The begging saved my life, though I did not know it when I saddled up that morning with my hat pulled low and my heart pulled lower. I am an old man now, and I have learned that a man tells the important stories backward. He starts at the wound and works toward the healing, because that's the only direction the truth runs in. So I'll start where the trouble started, which was with the water, or rather with the lack of it. In the summer the whole valley near went mad from thirst. The drought came the way real trouble always comes, slow and then all at once. First the grass went from green to the color of old rope, and the cattle worked harder for less, and a man told himself it would break by June. Then June came and did not break it. The Sabino Fork, which had run cold off the mountains every summer since God laid the mountains down, thinned first to a lazy trickle, then to a string of warm green pools with the fish dying belly up in them, and then to mud, and then, by the middle of that terrible June, to a bed of white stones that ticked in the heat all day long like something dying slow. I would walk out to it in the evenings, to that dry riverbed, the way you'd sit with a sick friend. I'd stand on the stones and hear them tick and click as they cooled, and I'd look up at the mountains where the water was supposed to come from, and I'd feel the particular helplessness of a man who has done everything right and is being ruined anyway. There is no work you can do against a sky that will not rain. You can dig, and I dug. You can pray, and I'll not say whether I prayed, but in the end you stand on the dry stones and you take your ruin like weather, because that is what it is. My cattle stood in the shade of the cottonwoods along the dead river with their heads hung low, and their ribs coming up under their hides like the staves of empty barrels, and when I walked out among them at dusk, they did not so much as flick an ear at me. A rancher learns to read a beast's eyes over enough years the way a doctor learns to read a man's. What I read in theirs, that June, was surrender, a giving up so total it went past fear into a kind of patience. And I knew that patience. I had worn it myself, on the worst nights, in the years since Sarah died, and to see it looking back at me out of the faces of my own cattle was a hard thing. My well was going too. It had been the one mercy of the place, a deep good well my Sarah's father had dug when he first broke the ground, 12 feet of sweet water even in the meanest years. That June I lowered the bucket and it came up half full and brown. A week later it came up a hand's depth and browner. I rationed it between the house and the horses and let the cattle fend at the mud holes, and I did the sum in my head every night of how many days I had before the well was a dry hole, and I was a ruined man walking off my own land, and the sum kept getting smaller. My nearest neighbor was a man named Call Barrow, a big loud fellow with a big loud opinion for every hour of the day. And it was Barrow who came riding into my yard on the worst-baked afternoon of that month with the answer already worked out. The way small frightened men always have the answer worked out before they have properly heard the question. "It's the Apache," he said, before he'd even swung down off his horse. He said it the way you'd announce a thing you'd already decided the whole world was going to agree with. "Up the fork, in the Red Rock, they've damned it, Elias. Turned the whole run onto their own patch and left us down here to burn." I gave his horse water, a dipperful from the brown well, because a man does that even for a fool, and I was not yet sure Barrow was a fool, only loud, and I asked him how he knew that. "Stands to reason," he said, wiping his mouth. "River don't just quit." "River quits every drought I ever saw," I said. "This one's just meaner than most." He looked at me the way a man looks at another man who has failed to be properly afraid with him, which is a look with some anger already in it. "You been up there? You seen?" "No," I admitted. "Then you don't know it ain't so." And there was a kind of low triumph in how he said it, because in his mind not knowing a thing was as good as proving it, so long as the not knowing pointed his fear in a direction it wanted to go. I did not argue him further that day, because there is no arguing a frightened man out of a comfort, and blame is a comfort. It is maybe the deepest comfort there is, next to hope. A thirsty, ruined man would 10 times rather have somebody to hate than a sky that will not rain, because you can ride against a man. You can do something about a man. You cannot do a single thing about the sky, and it is the doing nothing that breaks people. I understood all of that even then. What I did not yet understand was how fast it would spread, and how far it would carry, and how close it would come to putting blood on the ground. I watched Barrow ride off toward the next ranch with his answer, and I knew he'd tell it there the same way, and it would harden as it went from mouth to mouth the way mud hardens in the sun. And by the end of the week half the valley would hold it as gospel that the Apache up the fork had stolen their river. There is nothing on this earth so dangerous as frightened men who have been handed a direction to point their fear. I stood in my yard a long while after the dust of him had settled, and I looked at my brown well, and my dying cattle, and the long low house behind me where there was no longer any living soul to tell any of this to. My Sarah had been 3 years in the ground on the low hill behind the barn. I had dug that grave with my own hands and let no man in the valley lift a shovel to help me, not out of pride exactly, but because the digging was the last thing I could do for her, and I did not want it taken from me. And after I filled it in and set the stone, I had walled myself off from the whole living world so thoroughly and so quietly that I sometimes went a full week without speaking a single word aloud to another human being. I told myself I liked it that way. I told myself the quiet was peace. A man can tell himself very nearly anything if the house is empty enough and he says it to himself often enough in the dark. So I wanted understood that it was not neighborliness, and it was surely not brotherly love, that put me on my horse before dawn the next morning and pointed me up the dead fork toward the Apache camp in the Red Rock. It was something colder and more particular than that. It was that I had heard, years back from an old teamster who trapped that country, that there was a spring up in the canyons that never failed, a deep seep in the red stone the old-timers called the Blue Spring. And I meant to ride up and see with my own 2 eyes whether the river had been stolen, as Barrow swore, or had only gone down into the ground, the way all water finally goes home into the ground. I told myself I went to settle the question before Barrow got men killed over a lie. And that was half true, and it is the half I'd have given you if you'd asked me that morning. The other half I did not have a name for yet, and would not have one for some while, and it was this, that I was so tired of my own dead quiet that I would have ridden toward the sound of any trouble at all, just to feel something move in me again besides grief. I rode up out of the valley in the gray before sunup and climbed into the broken red country where the canyons start, and the deeper I went the stranger and finer the land got, great walls of rock going up rose and orange and violet as the sun found them, and hidden green folds where a little water still hid, and a silence up there that was different from the silence at my place. My silence was the silence of a thing that had stopped. This was the silence of a thing waiting. By mid-morning, following the dry bed of the fork up toward its head, I found the Blue Spring, and I found her. She was kneeling at the water with her back to me, filling clay jars, and she did not turn when my horse's iron shoe rang out clear on the bare stone, which told me plain that she had heard me coming a long time before I had heard myself, had heard me, and weighed me, and decided I was not worth turning around for yet. When she did rise and face me, she did it without any hurry at all, and without one flicker of fear, and that was the very first thing I ever learned about Taelna, that she gave a man nothing he had not earned, and the last thing she would ever give an armed stranger for free was her fear. She was maybe 30 years of age, with a face the frontier sun had made handsome rather than worn, strong through the cheek and the jaw, and she watched me come with dark level eyes that had already counted the rifle in my scabbard, the cracked state of my lips and the whole of my intentions, and had found me for the moment, and only for the moment, harmless. Behind her the spring lay cupped in a basin of red stone, and the water in it was the deep still blue of the evening sky just after the sun's gone, no bigger across than a wagon wheel, and it was full, and, God be thanked, it was moving. A thin thread of it slid over the lip of the basin and down into the sand and vanished. I have looked at gold in my time, and been moved less than I was moved by that little moving thread of water. "The river's dead in the valley," I said, because I did not know how to say a softer thing, and I did not yet know whether she had my tongue at all. "Men down there are saying your people stole it, dammed it up here. Men down there say many things." Her English came plain and careful, each word set down separate and true, like a stone laid straight into a wall by someone who means the wall to stand. "The river went into the ground. Your ground, our ground. It does not ask whose ground when it goes." She looked past me, down the canyon the way you look at a thing whose shape you already know by heart. "They will come up here with guns because of the saying." That is what the men down there do when they are afraid. They find a thing to point the fear at, and they load it. It so exactly matched the thing I had thought in my own yard the day before that I stood there a moment with nothing to say. Then, "Some of them," I said, "not all." "And you," she said it without heat, just weighing, "which are you?" "I came to see the truth of it," I said. "I've found it." I nodded at the little full moving spring. "Your people didn't take the river, it left, went into the ground like you say. I'll ride down and tell them so." Something moved around her eyes then, not a smile. She did not spend smiles on strangers, but the guardedness in them eased for the space of one breath. "They will not believe you," she said. "But it is a good thing to try to say a true thing to men who do not want to hear it. My father does this. It ages him." And there, unmistakable, was the driest thread of humor under the words, and it caught me off guard, because I had not expected to be near laughing at a spring in the red rock across a divide as wide as ours. My horse smelled the water and dropped its head and pulled at the rein, and I checked it, and I did a thing then that I have been glad of every day of my life since. I did not let the horse drink. I asked. "He's near done in," I said. "Might I water him?" "I'll not take more than the once." She looked at me a long moment, and I understood. I understood right down in my boots, the size of the thing I was asking, and the size of the thing she was weighing whether to give. That water was not water to her people. It was their whole life through a killing summer, the one seep that had not failed when everything else in that country failed. And here was an armed white stranger from the valley that hated them, asking to spend some of it on a horse. She stepped aside from the basin. "He may drink," she said. "Because you asked and did not take." I have turned that morning over 10,000 times in the long years since, and I have come to believe that the whole of everything that came after, the marriage, the years, the grave side by side up on my hill, the whole of it turned on that one small exchange of courtesy, mine and hers both. Two people from two worlds that had every reason under heaven to shoot first and talk never, choosing instead, for the length of one drink of water, to be decent to each other. That is where it all started. Not in love, in manners, in the simple refusal by both of us to take a thing we could ask for. I let the horse drink its fill while she watched, and I thanked her, and I rode back down out of the red rock toward the valley to keep the promise I'd made her, which was to try to say a true thing to men who did not want to hear it. I had no notion yet that I would fail at it so badly, nor of what my failing would nearly cost. Barrow had called a meeting at the Valley schoolhouse for that same evening, and I went to it. I want to be honest about my reasons. Part of me went to keep my word to the woman at the spring. But part of me, I can see it now, from the far end of my life, went because for the first time in 3 years I had a thing I badly wanted to say to living men, and I had been silent so long that the wanting to speak was its own kind of hunger. The schoolhouse was packed and hot, 30-odd men crowded in among the little desks with their hats in their hands and their fear in their faces, and Barrow up front by the teacher's table running the thing. He had the room half-lathered already when I came in. He had a map he'd drawn, showing the fork, and where he swore the dam was, though he had never been up there any more than I had until that morning. He had the whole story built and standing. I waited for a lull, and then I stood up in the back where they could all turn and see me, and I told them the truth as plain as I could lay it. I told them I had ridden up the fork that very morning, all the way to the head of it. I told them there was no dam. I told them the river had gone down into the ground the way rivers do in the meanest droughts, that the Apache had no more stolen their water than they had stolen the sun out of the sky. And then I told them the thing I most wanted them to hear, that there was a spring up in the red rock that had not failed, that still ran cold and sweet, and that the sensible thing, the neighborly thing, the only Christian thing, was to ride up their hat in hand and ask to share it through the dry months, the way you'd ask any neighbor in a hard year for the loan of a thing you needed and he had. For a moment there was quiet, and I let myself think, fool that I was, that plain truth might carry the day. Then Barrow got up red-faced and turned it. He was good at it, I'll grant the man that. He had a low gift for it. He did not call me a liar straight out. He did worse. He wondered out loud, gentle as you please, why a man would ride up alone to the Apache camp and come back so full of their side of things. He wondered whether maybe old Ward up on the Diller place had made himself some kind of arrangement up there. He wondered it soft, and he let the room fill in the rest, and I watched a low, ugly murmur go around those crowded desks that I did not like the sound of one bit, and I saw more than one face that had been friendly to me at church turn, and look at me now like I was a stranger, or worse. I've buried a wife in this valley in 15 years of my life, I said, and my voice was harder than I'd meant it. I've made no arrangement with anybody. I'm telling you the river went into the ground and there's water to be shared for the asking. You can ride up there like men and ask, or you can ride up there like a mob and take. And if you take it, there'll be blood, and it'll be on this valley's hands, and it'll be there long after the rains come back. It did no good. It maybe did harm. Barrow had turned the fear, and once fear is turned, truth is just noise. They near ran me out of the building. Old P. Elton, who I'd pulled a calf for not 2 springs back, would not meet my eye. I walked out into the dark and got on my horse, and behind me through the open schoolhouse door I could hear Barrow's voice rising and the room rising with it. And I knew as sure as I have ever known anything, that they were going to ride up that canyon, and they were going to do it with rifles across their saddles, and the only questions left open were how many days I had to stop it, and whether anyone would live through the answer. I did not sleep that night. I sat out on my porch in the dark with the dry riverbed a pale scar in the starlight and Sarah's grave a small black shape up on the hill, and I thought, for the first time in a long time, not about the dead but about the living. I thought about the woman at the spring, the level dark eyes of her, the dry thread of humor, the size of the courtesy she'd done a stranger's horse. And I noticed a thing that half frightened me. For the whole of the ride home from that spring that morning, the quiet inside me, the walled, shuttered, 3 years dead quiet I had called my peace, had not felt like peace at all. It had felt, for the first time since I filled in Sarah's grave, like a house with all its shutters nailed shut on a bright morning. Like something that ought to be opened. And I thought, sitting there in the dark, I have been dead 3 years and I have been calling it living. And somewhere up in the red rock there is a spring that is still running when everything else has quit, and I would rather stand near that spring, and near the woman keeping it, than near anything or anyone in this whole valley. I rode back up the fork at first light. I told myself I went to warn the camp of what was coming. That was, once again, the honest half of it. The other half I was just beginning to be able to name. They were watching for me, not with weapons, with watchers. 2 young men up on the canyon rims let my horse pass on up the trail without so much as showing themselves fully, and I understood that Taelna had spoken of me to her people, of the rancher who had asked instead of taken, and that this passage up the canyon was a thread of trust, so thin I could have broken it with one wrong move, and I rode it careful as a man crossing river ice. The camp lay in a green fold of the red rock near the head of the canyon, close by the blue spring, and it was smaller than Barrow's fevered map had made it, maybe 40 souls all told, no army, no horde. And they were lean. That was the thing that took the last of Barrow's story out of me the moment I saw them. They were as gaunt from that drought as my cattle were, as the whole valley was, children with the bones showing in their faces, old ones sitting in what shade there was, everyone moving slow the way people move when they are spending every calorie careful. They were not fat river thieves grown sleek on stolen water. They were people having the same murderous hard summer we were having, only with far less to fall back on and a great deal more to be afraid of, because they knew, the way Talna had known at the spring, that when frightened white men needed someone to blame, it would be them, and the blame would come loaded. Talna's father was the chief, or near enough as makes no difference in the telling, a man called Adiu, spare and gray-streaked and grave, with a stillness on him I have only ever seen in men who have carried a great many other people's lives a long way over hard ground. He did not trust me. He had not one reason on the round earth to trust me, and he did not pretend to. But he let his daughter stand and speak my words to him and his words back to me, and I told him, plain and quick, what I had seen and heard at the schoolhouse the night before, that the valley believed the lie that Barrow had turned them, that armed men were coming up this canyon and coming soon. I watched that news go into his face and not move a single line of it. When he answered, through Talna, he asked me the one question I have spent a lifetime trying to answer honest. "You ride from them," he said, "to warn us. Why?" And I stood there in the dust with my hat in both my hands, an armed stranger in a camp of people my whole world had taught me to hate, and I gave him the truest answer I had, which was not a grand one. "Because it's wrong," I said. "What they mean to do is wrong, and because I am tired down to my bones of standing with men who are wrong just because their skin happens to match mine. I'd sooner stand in the right with strangers than in the wrong with my own kind. I'm about out of years to waste standing in the wrong place." Talna did not turn that into her father's tongue right away. She looked at me first, a long, steady look, and something crossed between us in it that I had no words for then and have only poor ones for now. An old man by a cold hearth trying to describe the warmest thing that ever happened to him. Then she turned and spoke it to Adiu, and I saw the old man hear it, and weigh it, and I saw him make the decision to take a risk that he knew full well might cost him, and every soul in that green fold their lives, the risk of believing me. "Stay," he said through her. "If the guns come, we will see then what your warning is worth. If they do not come today, you will eat and go." What Talna and I built over the days that followed, we built mostly with our hands and not our tongues, because words, even with her doing the carrying of them back and forth, could only reach so far across a gap that wide. And what welded it, what turned a wary truce into the thing that changed the rest of my life, was a sick child, and the longest night I ever spent on this earth save the night I lost Sarah. There was a boy in the camp, maybe 6 or 7, a quick bright child called Little Fox in their tongue, who 2 days after I came took a fever bad. It was not the drought sickness. A rattlesnake, disturbed in the heat, had struck him on the calf while he gathered wood, and by the time I understood what had happened the leg was swollen tight and dark to the knee, and the boy was out of his head with the fever of it, and Adiu's face, bent over his grandson, was the face of a man watching the last of something precious go out of the world. I had worn that exact face myself, over a bed, 3 years gone. I knew it the way you know your own hand. And I knew this is the thing, this is the whole hinge of it. I knew that back down at my ranch in a cupboard Sarah had kept, there was a bottle of carbolic acid and a good store of clean-boiled linen and a sharp, clean knife, and that I had a steady hand at the hard work of lancing and draining a poisoned wound, learned over 15 years on 100 torn and snake-bit cattle, and once, God help me, on a wound of my dying wife's that the doctor came too late for. I knew I could maybe save the boy. And I knew, just as clear and cold, that if I laid my white hands on that Apache child and he died anyway, as bitten children often do, It would undo every thread of trust I had spun, and worse, they would say, and half believe, that the white man's medicine had killed him, and the killing that Barrow wanted would come from inside the camp instead of outside it. I stood there in the terrible heat with all of that turning in me, and then I looked at the boy, and I did the thing you do. I rode. I rode down to the ranch and back up again in a little more than half a day. The horse near foundered under me and lathered white, and I came back up that canyon at a dead run with the carbolic and the linen and the knife wrapped in my slicker. And it was full dark by the time I knelt down beside that child in the firelight of Adiu's shelter. Taelna worked beside me the whole of that night, and I have never before or since worked so close and so long with another soul. Her hands and mine were on that boy together from dark to dawn, hers holding him, steadying him, her voice going low, and even in the old words of a song I did not know and did not need to know, the meaning of it plain enough. Stay, stay, stay. And mine doing the hard, cruel, necessary work that healing so often is, the lancing, the draining, the terrible business of cleaning a poisoned wound while a child screams, which is a thing that takes something out of you that you never get all the way back. Adiu knelt across from us the whole night and never once looked away and never once told me to stop, and that too was a kind of courage I have not forgotten. Somewhere in the black dead middle of that night, past the hour when the body's own tide runs lowest, the fever broke. The boy's skin went from that dry burning heat to a sudden cool damp, and his thrashing stilled, and he sank down all at once into a real sleep, not the swoon of the fever but the deep, even breathing of a child worn out and mending. I felt it come. I had my hand on his small chest, and I felt the fight go out of him and the rest come in, and I sat back on my heels and I found I was shaking. Taelna looked at me across the sleeping child's body, and there were tears standing in her dark eyes, and she did not brush them away. She let me see them, which from her was a gift past any price. You could have let him be ours to lose, she said, very low so as not to wake him. A stranger's child, a child of the people the valley hates. You could have kept your hands clean of it and let him go. You did not. I've lost enough people, I said, and my own voice was not steady. I've stood at enough beds and been able to do nothing. I'm done with it. When I can stop it, I'm going to stop it, and I don't much care any more whose child it is. We sat up with the boy the rest of that night while he slept and mended and the fire burned down, and somewhere in the gray hours before dawn, with the worst past and the two of us hollowed out and honest the way you only get after a night like that, we told each other our griefs. She told me about her mother, dead 2 winters back of the coughing sickness that came up from the settlements, and how she had nursed her and lost her and taken up her mother's place as the one who healed the camp. And I told her about Sarah, the first time I had said my wife's name aloud to another living person in longer than I could reckon. I told her about the grave on the hill and the shovel I would let no man touch, and the shutters I had nailed over my own heart and called peace. And we found, the two of us, sitting over that sleeping mended child in the last of the dark, that we had been carrying the exact same weight the whole time, the same grief, worn down to the same smooth stone, only in 2 different tongues, on 2 different sides of a divide that suddenly did not seem so very wide as I had been raised to believe it was. That is the night I stopped being a dead man. I can set my finger on it that exact. Not the day I fell in love with her. That came on slower, and I could not date it if you paid me. But the night the deadness ended, the night the shutters came off, that was the night of the boy and the fever, and I have thanked God for that snake more times than any Christian rightly ought. Adiu came to me the next morning, when the boy woke and asked for water and drank it and knew his grandfather's face. The old man came and stood before me and put his hand flat on my shoulder and looked into my eyes a long moment, and he did not need his daughter to carry the meaning of that across to me. Some things a man can say with a hand on a shoulder that no tongue on earth improves upon. But the valley was still coming, and it came on the 4th day. I had known it would. I had ridden down once more in that stretch, keeping a foot in both worlds, and I had felt the thing building at the schoolhouse, and the mercantile the way you feel a storm build behind the mountains before you can see the first cloud of it. Barrow had his men. And on the fourth morning after the boys' fever broke, they came up the Sabino Canyon, a dozen mounted men with rifles laid across their saddle bows and Call Barrow at the head of them, up the narrow trail toward the green fold where the women and the old ones and little Fox, mending now but still weak, all waited behind the rocks. Taelna's two young watchers were up on the rims with their own weapons, and I saw, in one clear and terrible moment standing at the mouth of the camp, exactly how the whole thing would break. One nervous finger on either side, up on those rims or down in that trail, one shot from a shaking hand, and then a shot back, and then there would be no power in heaven or earth to stop it. And by nightfall that green fold in the red rock would be a thing men told their grandchildren about wrong for the next 50 years. A battle that was only a slaughter of frightened people over water that had been free for the asking the whole time. So I did the one thing left in me to do. I got up on my horse, and I rode it down the trail, and I turned it broadside across the narrow way, square between the 12 rifles coming up in the camp behind me, and I sat there. And this part I did on purpose, and I want it set down. I left my own rifle in its scabbard, and I put both my empty hands plain in view on the horn of my saddle, because a man with his hands empty is a harder man to shoot than a man with his hands full, and a far harder man to hate, and I did not want one soul in that trail able to tell himself I was the enemy. I wanted them to have to look at a neighbor. Elias. Barrow drew up, and the 11 behind him drew up, and the horses stamped and blew in the heat, and the rifles did not quite come up but did not go down either. Get out of the road. This ain't your fight. It's exactly my fight, Call, I said, and I made my voice carry down that whole line of men because I was talking to all of them, not just to him. There is a spring up here, not 200 yards behind me, that will water every last head of stock in the Diller Valley clean through to the rains if we ask to share it like Christian men. These people are not thieves. There is no dam. The river went into the ground, same as it went into the ground on my place and yours. And I will tell you something else. 3 nights ago these people and I sat up together till dawn and pulled a snake-bit child back from death with these 2 hands, side by side, theirs and mine, and there is a boy alive up in that camp this morning because of it. Now, I looked down the line of them face by face, men I knew, men I'd worshipped beside and pulled calves for. You can shoot through me to get up this canyon. You can start it that way with the murder of your own neighbor in cold blood over water that was free for the asking. And then you can spend the rest of your lives explaining to the territory, and to your wives, and to your God, why you did it. Or you can put up those rifles, and I will take you back to that spring myself, right now, and we will fill every barrel you brought, and ride home neighbors instead of murderers. Nobody moved. The heat rang and shimmered off the red rock, a horse stamped, somewhere a fly droned. I sat my horse with my empty hands on the horn, and my heart going like a hammer, and I did not know, in that long moment, which way it would fall. I have faced a few hard moments in a long life, and that one was the hardest, and the reason it was the hardest is that there was not one thing I could do to make it come out right except sit there empty-handed and be a neighbor and hope that was enough. It was Taelna who broke it, and she broke it in the bravest way I ever saw a human being do anything. She came down off the rocks. She walked out from behind me into the open trail, in the full clear view of a dozen nervous rifles, unarmed, her hands out where they could all be seen, and in those 2 hands she carried a plain clay jar of water from the blue spring, and she carried it toward Call Barrow the exact way you would carry your open hand toward a spooked and dangerous animal, slow and low, and with no fear showing to spark it. For your horses, she said in that plain, careful English into the dead silence of the trail, and for your children at home, there is enough. There has always been enough water in the blue spring, every summer, even this one. Your men only ever had to ask the way this man asked. No one who asks is turned away." And she held the jar out to call Barrow. I have seen brave things done in my time by armed men in hard places. I never in my life saw anything to touch that. An unarmed woman walking out into a dozen loaded rifles with a jar of water held out level in her two hands, offering peace to people who had every reason not to have earned it and none to expect it. And it shamed them. That is the only word for what I watched happen. You could see the shame of it move down the line of those 12 men like a hard wind moving through a field of standing wheat, bowing them one after another. 12 armed men looking at what they had ridden all the way up this canyon in the heat to do, and seeing it, finally and plainly, laid bare by one woman and one clay jar, for exactly the low and murderous thing it was. Call Barrow's big face worked. It worked a long moment, and then he did a thing I did not expect and have always since thought better of him for. He took off his hat. He took it clean off his head, there in front of all of them, the way a man does at a graveside or in a church, and he reached out and took the jar from her two hands, and he drank from it long, and I saw his throat move, and when he lowered it his eyes were wet and he would not look at me. "That's good water," he said, rough to no one. And he passed the jar down to the man beside him, and that man drank and passed it on, and it went all the way down that line of 12, hand to hand, each man drinking the piece the woman had offered, and by the time the empty jar came back the fight had gone out of that canyon entire, gone like water poured out on hot sand, soaked away to nothing. There would be no killing on the Sabino Fork that summer. A woman with a jar had seen to that. We shared the Blue Spring the rest of that killing summer. The valley men drove their stock up the canyon in appointed turns, and the Apache watered them at the spring, and not one thirsty animal was ever turned away. And slowly, in the way that these things move, which is slow, always slow, but sure, the story the valley told itself about the people up the fork began to change. Because it is a very hard thing to go on hating people who are, week upon week, keeping your cattle and your children alive. The men who came up snarling with their barrels came down quiet. Some of them came to know Adiu a little. One or two learned a few words of his tongue and taught him a few of theirs. Little Fox, mending fast the way children do, took to sitting on the rocks above the spring and watching the valley horses drink, and more than one hard valley man found himself, to his own surprise, waving up at the Apache boy he'd once have ridden past or worse. And when the rains finally broke that September, and they broke hard, a whole sky's worth at once, the dry Sabino running cold and brown and roaring down its bed inside of a day, the smell of wet earth coming up so strong after those dead months that grown men stood out in it and wept, the sharing did not stop. It had become another thing entirely by then. It had quit being a truce and become, without anyone quite deciding it, a set of neighbors. Which is the only thing two peoples on one piece of hard ground can ever safely be to each other, and the thing we all, on both sides of that divide, had come the closest in the world to killing each other rather than become. And Taelna. I will not dress it up in fine language, being no hand at fine language and too old now to start pretending to be. I fell in love with that woman over a snake-bit child, and a jar of water and 100 plain hard hours of working beside her. And she, for reasons I could not fully account for then and cannot now, a lonely gray widower with a grave on his hill and shutters just come off his heart, came in her own time to love me back. Her father saw it before either one of us had the courage to say it out loud. Adiu came to me at the end of that summer, and this time his daughter did not stand between us to carry the words, because by then he had learned enough of my tongue and I enough of his that we could meet somewhere in the middle of the two, which is, I have come across a long life to believe, the only place where two peoples, or two people, ever truly do meet, not on his ground and not on mine, but out in the middle, in the language you build together. She is not a thing that I give to you, the old man said to me, slow and careful and watching my face very hard as he said it, so there could be no mistaking his meaning. Hear me, she goes where she chooses to go, always. She has chosen strange, And here the driest ghost of a smile crossed his grave face, the very same smile his daughter had, the family smile. "You will be kin to us. You will not own her. No man owns her. You will keep her and she will keep you, and that is a different thing and the only thing I will bless." "I know it," I said, and I meant it down to the ground. "I would not have her any other way, Addie. She's not a thing any man could own, and I'd not want the woman who could be owned. I'll keep her and be kept, and count myself the richest man in the territory for it, till the day I die." Taelna chose me in the open. She chose me in front of both our peoples, standing straight and level-eyed the way she had stood the first morning at the spring, and she rode down out of the red rock to the Diller Valley of her own free will, on her own horse, beside me and not behind me. We were married that autumn in a way that honored her people and mine both, under the cottonwoods along the fork that ran cold again, and there was not one man in that whole valley who dared say a word against it, who valued his own standing among his neighbors, because that valley remembered, and would remember for a generation, whose jar of water it was that had kept its hands from murder in the summer the wells ran dry. She would not be shut up in my quiet house, and I thank God for that too. She threw its shutters wide, the real ones and the other ones both. She planted things in the dead ground by the porch and made them grow. She healed valley folk who a year before would have crossed the street sooner than pass close to her, and who now came knocking at our door hat in hand with their sick children in their arms, and she turned none of them away, any more than she had turned away a stranger's thirsty horse. She healed her own people up in the Red Rock, riding up the canyon in all weathers with her bag of medicines. And she healed me, which was the hardest of the 3 cures and took much the longest, being a deep old wound gone stubborn, but she was patient, and she was not afraid of hard cases, and in the end she did it. Little Fox grew up tall, and called our ranch his second home, and called me by a word in his own tongue that I could never say right but which comes over into mine, near as I can render it, as the one who stood in the road. I am very old now, as I said at the start. Taelna rests up on the low hill behind the barn these 3 years past, up beside Sarah, the two of them keeping each other company up there through the seasons in a way the living somehow never quite managed to arrange, and I like to think they'd have had a great deal to say to one another. I'll be going up to lie down between the two of them before very much longer, and when I do, I will lie down there counting myself the richest fool who ever rode up a dry canyon meaning to beg for water, and came down again with his whole life given back to him. But I wanted it set down plain here, for whoever reads it after I'm gone, that the whole valley was wrong that summer, and that I was, for a good while, every bit as wrong as any of them. I was raised to the wrongness the same as they were. It took a killing drought to drive me up the Sabino Fork with my heart nailed shut against the world, and a woman at a blue spring who gave a stranger's horse a drink because he asked and did not take, to teach me the last true thing I ever needed on this earth to learn. The ground does not care whose it is. The water does not ask whose it is when it goes down into the dark, nor when it comes back up into the light. There was always enough. There was always enough. We only ever had to ask. I stayed. And the staying turned into days, and the days taught me the camp, and the camp taught me how much of my whole life I had believed on the word of frightened men who had never once ridden up a canyon to look. Those first days I lived with a foot planted in each of 2 worlds, and I will tell you it is a hard way to stand. Mornings I would be up in the green fold in the red rock, learning the shape of the people there, who was old and who was ailing, which of the young men were steady and which were spring-loaded, where the shade fell in the afternoons and where the children played. And then some evenings I would ride back down to the valley to keep my ear on the thing building there, because a man who means to stand between 2 dangers has to know the temper of both, and I could feel the valley's temper going bad the way you feel meat go off before you can rightly smell it. Down in the valley I had become, in the space of one schoolhouse meeting, a stranger among people I had lived beside for 15 years. It is a peculiar loneliness, that, To walk into the mercantile you have traded at since before your wife died, and have the talk go quiet, and have a man you have loaned your team to look at his boots rather than at you. Barrow had done that. He had not needed to call me a liar. He had only needed to wonder out loud, gently, once in a crowded hot room, and let the wondering do its slow work. By the second day of it, there were men in the Diller Valley half convinced that Elias Ward had thrown in with the Apache, and the other half were not sure enough of me to say different. And so I found that I had lost, in one honest speech, a place I had held quietly for a decade and a half. I would like to say it did not sting, it stung. But I had buried a wife and learned, at least, the size of real loss, and set against that a cold shoulder at the mercantile is a small thing, and I found I could carry it. And there was this, which surprised me. Up in the Red Rock, where I had every reason to be the stranger, I was less of a stranger with each passing day than I was among my own. The people of the camp watched me careful. Of course they did. They would have been fools not to. But they watched me the way you watch a thing you are deciding about, not the way you watch a thing you have already decided against. There is a world of difference between those two kinds of watching, and I had somehow contrived, that summer, to get the hopeful kind from strangers and the closed kind from my neighbors, and I have thought since that the arrangement told me something true about which of the two groups was the more honest. It was little Fox who cracked the camp open to me, the way children so often are the ones who crack a hard thing open, being too young yet to have learned all the reasons not to. He was 6 or 7, quick and bright and afraid of nothing, and on my second day up there he attached himself to me and my horse and would not be shoed. He wanted to know everything about the horse, its name, which it had, and what the name meant, which took some translating, and whether it would bite, which it would not, and whether he might sit up on it, which, after I got a nod from a watching ant, he did, gripping the horn with both small hands and grinning down at the whole camp like a chief surveying his country. I have had, in a long life, a good deal of praise from grown men that meant less to me than the trust of that one small boy who did not yet know he was supposed to be afraid of me. And it was through the boy, in the natural way of such things, that I came to spend my hours near Taelna, because she was the one who healed the camp and the boy was always underfoot near her, and so I was always underfoot near her, and neither of us, I think, went very far out of our way to correct the arrangement. We worked. That is how it built between us, not with sweet words. We had few enough words in common for sweetness, but with work done side by side, which is a truer foundation for a thing than sweetness anyhow. I mended a corral rail that had rotted, and she held the post while I set it, and neither of us said much, and it was a good afternoon. She showed me a plant that grew in the wet seam below the spring, and pressed its cool leaf to a burn a woman had taken from a cook fire, and I told her about the carbolic I kept, and we traded in that halting way, the small hard-won knowledge that people who tend the sick and the hurt accumulate, hers and mine, and found that a great deal of it was the same knowledge wearing different clothes. A poultice is a poultice. A clean wound heals, and a dirty one festers whether the hands that clean it are red or brown. We learned each other's competence first, before we learned anything softer, and I have come to think that is the right order, that you should know a person is good at the hard necessary things before you let yourself go soft on them. She gave nothing away in those days that she did not mean to give. I would catch her watching me sometimes, weighing, the way she had weighed me that first morning at the spring, and I did not mind it. I would rather be weighed honestly by a careful woman than flattered by a careless one, and I had had in Sarah one careful woman already, and knew the worth of the breed. But now and again the guardedness would ease, the way it had eased at the spring over some foolishness of the boys, or when I got a word of her tongue badly wrong, and she corrected me, and I got it wrong again the same way. And there would be that near smile of hers, the one that did not spend itself on the mouth but eased something around the eyes, and each time I saw it I felt the shuttered house inside me get one more nail pulled. I did not name what was happening. I was 3 years a widower and out of the habit of hope, and I would have told you, if you had asked me plainly in that first week, that I was a man doing a decent thing in a hard summer and nothing more. But a man can lie to himself only so long as nothing tests the lie, and mine got tested, hard, on the night the boy took the fever. It came on him fast, the way snakebite does in the very young. He had gone out at the edge of the light to gather wood, the way he did every evening, careful and proud of the chore, and in the dusk he did not see the rattler coiled in the last of the day's heat by a flat stone, and it struck him on the calf before he knew it was there. He did not even cry out much at first. I heard later he came walking back into the camp on his own, white-faced, saying only that something had bitten him, and it was not until his grandmother saw the 2 dark marks and the leg already beginning to swell that the camp understood what had happened, and the understanding went through it like cold water. By the time I came to him, I had been down at the corral and came running at the sound of the women's voices. The leg was swollen tight to the knee and going dark, and the boy was already sliding out of himself into the fever, his bright eyes gone glassy and far, and his small body beginning that terrible restless turning that a body does when the poison is in deep and the fight is on in earnest. Adio knelt over his grandson, and the camp's own healer woman worked with the remedies they had, and I stood back at first, because it was not my place to push in, and I watched their remedies fail. I do not say they were poor remedies. I say the poison was deep and the boy was small, and some things are past the reach of any medicine on earth. But I watched Adio's face as he knelt there, and I saw it change, saw the healer's concentration in it give way by degrees to a thing I knew far too well, the face of a man beginning to understand that he is going to lose the one he is bent over. I had worn that face myself over a bed 3 years gone, and I could not have looked away from it if I had wanted to. And I knew this is the whole hinge of that night, and of a good deal that came after. I knew that down at my ranch, in the cupboard that had been Sarah's, there was a bottle of carbolic and a store of clean-boiled linen and a good sharp knife, and that I had a steady hand at the hard, slow work of lancing and drawing a poisoned wound, learned over 15 years on more torn and snake-bit cattle than I could count. And once, God forgive me, on a herd of my dying wife's that the doctor came too late to tend. I knew I might with those things and those hands save the boy, and I knew in the very same cold breath the price of being wrong. If I laid my white hands on that Apache child and he died anyway, and bitten children die, more of them than live, when the poison goes as deep as this had gone, then I would not only have failed, I would have handed Barrow's people, and the frightened ones in this camp too, the story they were each already half inclined to believe, that the white man's medicine had killed him. The trust I had spun so careful would burn, and the killing might come from inside the green fold rather than up the canyon. I stood there in the firelight with all of that turning over in me, weighing it the way you weigh a thing you already know you are going to do. And then I looked at the boy, at little Fox, who had sat up on my horse 2 days before and grinned down at his whole world, and I stopped weighing. And I went to Adio and I told him, through his daughter, that I had medicine and a knowing hand down at my place, and that I would ride and fetch it if he would let me lay hands on the boy, and that I would not lie to him. The boy might die anyway, and if he did, it would not be the medicine that killed him but the poison that was already killing him, and that this was the truth, and he must decide on the truth. Adio looked at me a long, long moment across his grandson's turning body. Then he said one word, and Taelna did not need to translate it, because it is near the same short word in his tongue as in a child's in any tongue. Go. I rode. I have ridden that stretch of country 1,000 times before and since, but I never rode it like I rode it that night, down out of the red rock in the dark with the horse finding its own feet on the trail because there was no light to find them by. Then flat out across the dry valley floor, down and back in a little better than half a day with the horse near foundered white, and blowing under me and my own heart going the whole way like a fist on a door. I threw the carbolic and the linen and the knife into my slicker, and I did not so much as break stride at the ranch, just wheeled the poor beast and drove it back up the canyon into the dark, and it was full night, and the camp was one low fire and a ring of watching faces, when I got down at last beside the boy. Taelna worked beside me the whole of that night, and I have never in my life, before or since, worked so close and so long with another living soul. From full dark to the first gray of dawn, her hands and mine were on that child together, hers holding him, steadying him against the pain, one hand always somewhere on him, at the brow, at the small heaving chest, and her voice going low, and even the whole time in the old words of a song I did not know and did not need to know, for the meaning of it needed no carrying across. Stay, stay, stay. And my hands did the other work, the hard and cruel and necessary work that healing so terribly often is, the lancing, the drawing, the slow, careful cleaning of a poisoned wound while a child cries out, which is a thing that takes something out of the one who does it that he does not ever get all the way back. I will not set the particulars of it down. It is enough to say it was hard and long, and that more than once in the middle of it I did not believe it would answer, and that the only thing that kept my own hand steady through it was the other pair of hands across from mine, steady as stone, and the low, even voice that never once broke. Adio knelt at the boy's head the entire night and never looked away and never once told me to stop, and I want that set down, because I have known grown men who could not watch such work done on a beast, let alone on their own blood, and the old chief watched it done on his grandson from dark to dawn without flinching, because he had decided to trust the truth I had told him, and having decided it, he did not take it back when it got hard to look at. That is a rarer kind of courage than the kind that rides up canyons with a rifle, and I honor it still. And then, somewhere in the black dead middle of the night, in that lowest hour, past midnight and before the birds, when the body's own tide runs out the farthest, and the very old and the very sick so often slip away on the ebb of it, the fever broke. I felt it come. I had my hand flat on the boy's small chest, and I felt the change go through him all at once, the dry burning heat of the skin breaking suddenly into a cool damp, the restless turning going still, the fast shallow breath dropping down all at once into the deep and even breathing of a child worn clean out and at last mending. Not the swoon of the fever, sleep, real sleep. I felt the fight go out of him and the rest come in, under my own hand, and I sat back on my heels in the dying firelight and found that I was shaking all over like a man who has been cold a long time. Taelna looked at me across the boy's sleeping body, and there were tears standing bright in her dark eyes, and this is the thing I have held onto all my life. She did not brush them away. She let me see them. From her, who gave nothing away that she did not mean to give, the letting me see them was a gift past any price I could have named. You could have kept your hands clean of him, she said, very low so as not to wake him. A stranger's child, a child of the people your valley hates. You could have let him be ours to lose, and no man down there would have thought the worse of you. You did not. I have lost enough people, I said, and my own voice was not steady either, and I did not try to make it so. I have stood at enough beds and been able to do not one thing. I am done with it. When I can stop it, I mean to stop it, and I find I have got past caring whose child it is. We sat up with him the rest of that night while he slept and mended and the fire burned down to red coals, and in the hollowed-out honest hours before dawn. And there is a particular honesty that comes only after a night like that one, when you are too emptied to keep up any of your usual walls. We told each other our griefs. She told me of her mother, dead 2 winters gone, of the coughing sickness that had come up out of the settlements, and how she had nursed her through it and lost her all the same, and how she had taken up her mother's place after as the one who kept the camp's health, so that she had been, ever since, the one who stood at the beds and could not always stop it, exactly as I had been. And I told her of Sarah. I said my wife's name aloud to her, the first time I had said my wife's name aloud to any living soul in longer than I could reckon, and it did not break me to say it, as I had always feared it would. It eased me. I told her of the grave on the hill and the shovel I would let no man in the valley touch, and of the shutters I had nailed, one by one, over my own heart in the years after, and had called the nailing peace. And we found, the two of us, sitting there over a sleeping Mendied child in the last of the dark, that we had been carrying the very same weight the whole of the time, the same grief, worn down over the same handful of years to the same smooth hard stone, only in two different tongues, on two different sides of a divide that had begun, somewhere in that long night, to look to me a great deal narrower than the whole world had raised me to believe it was. I have said already that this was the night I stopped being a dead man, and I will say it once more here because it is the truest thing in this whole account. It was not the day I fell in love with her, which came on slower, and which I could not date for you if you offered me the ranch to do it. It was the night the deadness ended. It was the night the last of the shutters came off, over a sleeping child and a burned-down fire, and I have thanked God for that rattlesnake more times in my life than any right-thinking Christian ought. Addie came to me in the morning, when the boy woke and asked in a small clear voice for water, and drank it, and knew his grandfather's face and smiled at it. The old man came and stood before me in the new light, and put his hand flat on my shoulder, and looked into my eyes a long moment, and said nothing at all, and needed to say nothing at all. For there are things a man can say with one hand laid on another man's shoulder that no tongue on this earth has ever improved upon, and that was one of them, and I have carried the weight of that hand on my shoulder all my life and been the better man for it. But the valley was still coming, and on the fourth day after the boy's fever broke, it came. I had known it would. I had kept my foot in both worlds all that week for just this reason, and I had felt the thing building down below the way you feel a storm build up behind the mountains before ever you see the first gray edge of a cloud. Barrow had his men. He had talked the fear back up in them after the schoolhouse. Fear is like a fire. It wants only tending to come back, and Barrow was a patient tender of it. And on the fourth morning they came up the Sabino Canyon, a dozen mounted men with their rifles laid ready across their saddle bows and Call Barrow at the head of them, riding up the narrow trail toward the green fold where the women and the old ones and little Fox, mending now but still weak and pale, all waited behind the rocks. Tailna's two young watchers were up on the canyon rims with their own weapons, and I saw, standing at the mouth of the camp and looking down that trail, in one clear and utterly terrible moment, exactly how the whole thing was going to break. One nervous finger on either side up on those rims or down in that trail, it would not matter which, one shot from one shaking hand, and then a shot back, and then there would be no power in heaven above or on the earth below able to stop it. And by nightfall that green fold in the red rock would be a thing men told their grandchildren about wrongly for 50 years. A battle, on the Sabino Fork, that was only ever going to be a slaughter of frightened, half-starved people over water that had been free for the asking the whole hot summer long. So I did the one thing that was left in me to do. I got up on my horse, a fresh one, I had sense enough for that, and I rode it down the trail, and I turned it broadside across the narrow way, square between the 12 rifles coming up in the camp waiting behind me, and I sat there in the middle of it. And this next part I did with deliberate care, and I want it set down exactly. I left my own rifle in its scabbard, and I laid both my hands plain and open on the horn of my saddle where every man of them could see they held nothing. Because a man with his hands empty is a harder man to shoot than a man with his hands full, and which mattered more that morning, he is a far harder man to hate. I did not want one soul in that trail to be able to tell himself, in the moment his finger tightened, that he was firing on an enemy. I wanted them to have to look up that trail and see a neighbor sitting his horse with his hands empty, and I wanted the seeing to be hard for them, because hard seeing was the only weapon I had. Elias. Barrow drew rein a good way off, and the 11 behind him drew rein, and the horses stamped and blew in the climbing heat, and the rifles came part way up and hung there, neither raised nor lowered. "Get out of the road. This ain't your fight." "It is exactly my fight call," I said, and I pitched my voice to carry all the way down that line of men, because I was not talking to Barrow. I was talking to the other 11, the ones who had come up more out of fear and the pull of the crowd than out of any real hunger to kill, which is to say most of them. "There is a spring up here, not 200 yards behind me, that will water every last head of stock in the Diller Valley clear through to the rains, if we ask to share it like Christian men instead of taking it like thieves. There is no dam. There never was a dam. The river went down into the ground, on their land and on ours alike, the same as it has gone down in every hard drought since before any of us was born. And I will tell you one thing more, and you may believe it or not as you choose, but it is God's truth. 3 nights ago, the people in that camp behind me and I sat up together until the dawn and pulled a snake-bit child back from the very edge of death with our 4 hands, theirs and mine together, and there is a boy alive up there this morning because of it. That is who you have ridden up this canyon to kill." I ran my eyes slow down the whole line of them, face by face, men I had known for years, men I had worshipped beside of a Sunday and pulled calves for in the spring mud. "Now, you can shoot through me to get up this trail. You can start it that way, call with the murder of your own neighbor in cold blood, with his hands empty on his saddle horn, over water that was free for the asking. And then every man of you can spend what's left of his life explaining that to the territory, and to your wives, and to your children, and to your God. Or you can put up those rifles and I will take you to that spring myself this hour, and we will fill every barrel and skin you brought up here, and you can ride back down this canyon neighbors instead of murderers. Those are the 2 roads. There is no third one. Choose." And then nobody moved, and nobody spoke, for the longest moment of my whole long life. The heat rang and shimmered off the red rock walls. A horse stamped and its bit jingled. Somewhere off in the brush a fly droned, loud in all that silence. I sat my horse in the middle of the trail with my empty hands resting on the horn and my heart going against my ribs like a hammer, and I did not know. I will not pretend to you now that I knew, because I did not which way it was going to fall. I have faced a handful of hard moments across a long life, and that one was the hardest of them all, and the reason it was the hardest is this. There was not one single further thing I could do to bend it toward life. I had said all there was to say. Now I could only sit there empty-handed and be a neighbor in the middle of the road and pray that being a neighbor was going to be enough, when so often in this world it is not. And it was Talna who broke it, and she broke it in the very bravest way that I have ever, in all my years, seen a living human being do anything at all. She came down off the rocks. She walked out from behind my horse into the open trail, in the full and clear view of a dozen nervous rifles, unarmed, her 2 hands held out where every man of them could see them plain, and in those 2 hands she carried a plain clay jar of water, dipped fresh from the blue spring, and she carried it forward toward Call Barrow in exactly the way you would carry your open hand out toward a spooked and dangerous animal. Slow and low, and with not one flicker of fear showing anywhere on her to strike a spark off theirs. "For your horses," she said, into the dead, ringing silence of that trail in her plain and careful English so that every man heard it, "and for your children at your homes, there is enough. There has always been enough water in the blue spring, every summer, even this one that has burned so hard. Your men only ever had to ask for it, the way this man beside me asked. No one who comes and asks is turned away from it. No one ever has been." And she held the clay jar out, level in her 2 steady hands, toward Call Barrow. I have seen brave things done in my time by armed men in hard corners. I have never in all my life seen anything to touch that, an unarmed woman walking out alone into a dozen loaded rifles, with a jar of water held level in her 2 hands, offering peace to men who had done nothing on this earth to earn it and had every reason not to expect it. And it shamed them. That is the only honest word for the thing I watched happen in that trail. You could see the shame of it move down the line of those 12 men like a hard wind, moving through a field of standing summer wheat. bowing them over one after the next, 12 armed men, looking at what they had ridden all the way up this hot canyon to do, and seeing it at last laid bare and plain by one woman and one clay jar of water, seeing it finally for exactly the low and murderous and shabby thing that it was. Call Barrow's big red face worked. It worked a long moment, and I watched it work, and I did not know still which way even he would go. And then he did a thing I had not looked for and have thought the better of him for every day since. He took off his hat. He took it clean off his head, there in front of all of them, slow, the way a man takes his hat off at a graveside or coming into a church. And he leaned down from his saddle and reached out and took the jar from her two steady hands, and he drank from it long, and I watched his throat work as he swallowed. And when he lowered the jar, his hard eyes were wet, and he would not, could not, look up the trail at me. "That's good water," he said, rough and low to nobody to the ground. And then he passed the jar down to the man on his right, and that man drank from it and passed it on, and it went all the way down that line of 12, hand to hand and mouth to mouth, each man in his turn drinking the piece that the woman had walked out and offered them. And by the time the empty jar came back up the line to her hands, the fight had gone out of that canyon altogether. Gone the way water goes when you pour it out on hot sand at noon, soaked away into nothing, as though it had never been. There would be no killing on the Sabino Fork that summer. One woman, with one clay jar of water and no weapon at all in her two hands, had walked out into a dozen rifles and seen to that. We shared the blue spring the rest of that killing summer, and the sharing of it did more to unmake the lie than any speech of mine at any schoolhouse ever could have. Because a lie can outlast an argument, but it cannot outlast a thing done, over and over, week upon week, in the plain sight of everyone. We worked out the turns of it that same afternoon, standing there in the trail where the guns had been an hour before, Barrow and Addie and me, with Tailna carrying the words back and forth between the two old men and the sun going down red behind the rock. The valley men would drive their stock up the canyon on set days, so many head at a time, so as not to foul the water nor crowd the camp, and the Apache would tend the spring and see the animals watered, and no thirsty beast that came up asking would be turned away. It was a plain arrangement, the kind two sets of ranchers might work out over any shared thing in any hard year, and there was nothing in it, set down flat like that, to mark it as the miracle it was. But it was a miracle, and every man who came up that canyon that summer knew it in his bones, because every man of them remembered how close he had come to riding up it for another purpose entirely. The first days of it were stiff. I will not pretend they were not. The valley men came up wary and left quick, and kept their hands near their saddle guns for no reason but old habit and old fear, and the young men of the camp watched them go with faces that gave away nothing. But water is a great softener of men. It is hard to go on hating a people who are, day after day, keeping your cattle alive and your children's milk cow standing, and harder still when you have looked in their faces while they did it and found their only tiredness and care, and the same worn worry you carry yourself. By the third week the wariness had begun to wear thin. Men who had come up snarling came down quiet, and then came up not snarling at all. One of them, a close-mouthed old widower named Hollies who ran cattle on the far bench, and had said not one word for or against me at the schoolhouse, took to lingering at the spring after his stock had drunk, and fell into a wordless sort of friendship with an Apache man near his own age over the shared business of doctoring a horse's split hoof, and the two of them worked out between them, with signs and grunts and a few traded words. A way of talking that served them fine and needed no help from me. I watched that happen, and I thought, this is how it goes then, not with speeches, with a split hoof and two old men who both know how to mend one. Little Fox mended fast, the way children do, the fever a bad memory and the leg going strong under him again inside of a fortnight, and he took to sitting up on the warm rocks above the spring in the long afternoons to watch the valley horses come up and drink. And more than one hard valley man, riding down out of that canyon behind his watered stock, found himself lifting a hand in a wave up at the Apache boy on the rock. The same boy, the same people, that he'd have ridden past cold, or worse, a month before. I saw Call Barrow do it once. I saw him lift 2 fingers off his rein in a small rough salute up at Little Fox, and I saw the boy grin down and wave both arms back at him. And I turned my horse away so Barrow would not see me having seen it, because a man who is only just learning to be ashamed of himself, and better for the shame, does not need a witness standing by to make it harder. And then in the middle of September, the rains broke. They broke all at once, the way the long droughts always break, as if the sky had been holding its breath the whole burnt summer and let it all go in a day. The clouds came up black behind the mountains in the afternoon, and the first fat drops raised little craters of dust in the dead yards, and then it came down in earnest, a whole season's worth of water falling out of the sky at once, drumming on the roofs, hissing in the brush, running off the baked hard ground faster than the ground could take it. And the dry Sabino, the poor dead fork that had ticked and clicked its white stones at me all summer long like a thing giving up, the Sabino ran. Inside of a day it was running cold and brown and roaring down its bed, bank to bank, carrying sticks and froth and the whole glad noise of it down through the valley. And the smell that came up off the wet ground after those dead months was so strong and so sweet that grown men walked out into the rain and stood in it bareheaded and let it run down their faces, and some of them wept, and were not ashamed to be seen doing it. And the sharing did not stop. That is the thing. The river ran again, and the wells filled, and the plain need that had driven the 2 peoples together was gone, and the sharing did not stop, because it had quit being about need somewhere back in the summer and become about something else, without anyone quite standing up and deciding it. It had stopped being a truce and become, quietly, a set of neighbors, which is the only thing that 2 peoples on one hard piece of ground can ever safely be to each other, and the very thing that all of us, on both sides of that divide, had come within one nervous trigger finger of killing each other rather than allow ourselves to become. And Taelna, I will not dress it up in fine language, being no hand at fine language, and far too old now to take up the pretending of it. The plain truth is that I fell in love with that woman over a snake-bit child and a jar of water and 100 plain hard hours of work done side by side, and that she, for reasons I could not fully account for then and cannot fully account for now, a gray lonely widower with a grave up on his hill, and the shutters only just pried off his heart, came, in her own time and by her own reckoning, to love me back. It did not come on with speeches. There were no speeches in it anywhere. It came on the way the good deep things come on, slow and sideways, so that you cannot mark the day. Only look up one afternoon and find that it is already so and has been so for some while, and that the whole shape of your life has quietly rearranged itself around it while you were busy doing something else. Her father saw it before either one of us had found the courage to say it out loud. Of course he did. Fathers do. Adil came to me at the end of that summer, and this time his daughter did not stand between us to carry the words back and forth, because by then the old man had picked up enough of my tongue, and I enough of his, that the 2 of us could meet somewhere out in the middle of the 2 languages, which is, I have come across a long life to believe, the only place where 2 peoples or 2 people ever truly do meet. Not on his ground and not on mine, but out in the middle, in the halting patched-together tongue you build together as you go, that belongs to neither of you and so belongs to both. She is not a thing that I give to you, the old man said to me, slow and careful, watching my face very hard the whole time he said it, so that there could be no smallest mistaking of his meaning. Hear me, Ward. She goes where she chooses to go, always, since she was a child always. She has chosen strange. And here the driest ghost of a smile crossed his grave old face, the very same near smile his daughter had, that did not spend itself on the mouth, the family smile, and it undid me a little to see where she had got it from. You will be kin to us. You will not own her. No man owns her. You will keep her, and she will keep you, and that is a wholly different thing, and it is the only thing I will put my blessing on." "I know it, Adu," I said, and I meant it down to the soles of my boots. I would not have her any other way. She is not a thing that any man could own, and I would not want the woman who could be. I'll keep her and be kept by her, and count myself the richest man in this whole territory for the keeping and the being kept, until the day I die. And Taelna chose me. She chose me in the open, in front of both our peoples, standing straight and level-eyed the very way she had stood that first morning at the spring when she weighed a thirsty stranger and decided he was worth a drink of water. She rode down out of the red rock to the Diller Valley of her own free will, on her own horse, at my side and not behind me. I have thought since that a man could learn near everything he needs to know about a marriage from watching whether the woman rides beside or behind, and mine rode beside always, to the end of her days. We were married that autumn under the cottonwoods along the fork that ran cold and full again, in a way that honored her people and mine both, the two ceremonies laid together into one so that neither was slighted, and there was not one man in the whole Diller Valley who dared to say a word against it, who set any value on his own standing among his neighbors, because that valley remembered, and would go on remembering for a generation and more, whose clay jar of water it was that had kept its hands clean of murder in the summer the wells ran dry. She would not be shut up in my quiet house, and I have thanked God for that too, near as often as I have thanked him for the snake. She threw its shutters wide, the wooden ones and the other ones both. She dug in the dead hard ground along the porch that had grown nothing in the 3 years since Sarah, and she coaxed things up out of it that I would have sworn that ground could not raise. She healed valley folk who a single year before would sooner have crossed to the far side of the street than pass close to her, and who now came knocking at our door hat in hand with their sick children held in their arms, and she turned away not a one of them, no more than she had turned away a stranger's thirsty horse on the first morning I ever saw her. She rode up the canyon in every weather with her bag of medicines to tend her own people in the Red Rock, and often as not I rode up beside her, and was made welcome there as kin, and grew gray being made welcome there. And she healed me, which was the hardest of all her cures, and took her much the longest, being an old wound gone stubborn and deep and long neglected. But she was a patient hand, and she had never in her life been afraid of a hard case, and in the end, in her own slow, sure time, she did it. Little Fox grew up tall and straight, with no worse mark of that bad summer than a pale seam on his calf, and he called our ranch his second home to the end of my days, and he called me, always, by a word in his own tongue that I could never once say right to save my life, but which comes over into mine, near as I have ever been able to render it, as the one who stood in the road. I am very old now, as I told you at the start, and I have earned the right to be plain about the end of it. Taelna rests up on the low hill behind the barn these 3 years past, up alongside Sarah, the two of them keeping each other's company up there through all the turning seasons in a way that the living, for all our trying, somehow never quite managed to arrange down here. And I like to think, being a foolish old man with time to think foolish things, that the two of them found a great deal to say to one another up there, and that they were easier with each other than the world would ever have guessed two such women could be. I will be going up the hill myself to lie down between the two of them before very much longer now. I can feel it coming the gentle way you feel evening come, and when I go, I mean to lie down there counting myself the very richest fool who ever rode up a dry canyon meaning to beg a little water off people he had been raised to hate, and came back down out of it, without ever once meaning to, carrying his whole life given back to him new. But I wanted it set down plain here in my own words, for whoever it is that reads this after I am gone up that hill, the whole valley was wrong that summer, and I was, for a long while, every bit as wrong as any man in it. I was raised to the wrongness the same as the rest of them were, and I wore it as easy and unthinking as I wore my own hat. It took a killing drought to drive me up the Sabino Fork with my heart nailed shut against the whole living world, and it took a woman at a blue spring, who gave a stranger's thirsty horse a drink of her people's life because the stranger asked, and did not take, to teach me the one last true thing that I ever needed on this earth to learn. The ground does not care whose it is. The water does not ask whose it is when it goes down into the dark, nor whose it is when it comes back up again into the light. There was enough. All that long burnt summer, when men were loading rifles over it and riding up canyons to kill each other for it, there was enough, and there had always been enough, and there was enough left over besides to heal a valley and a widower and to raise a garden out of dead ground. There was always enough. We only ever had to ask.